if you give the ear something natural and easy to work with, it spends less time having to try and overcome the problems that it's hearing. If you're giving the ear something which it feels it has to compensate for, we have in our heads the world's best graphic equalizer. Has a natural filtering process which allows us to accommodate all sorts of things which don't sound quite right and make them sound right. But to do that, it has to work hard. It's like a supercomputer, working flat out and getting very hot doing it. If you can take that processing out, then you begin to relax and enjoy the music.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining us. We're here with Peter Comeau, who has a legendary tenure with the business, but currently working with IAG. What does IAG stand for?
International Audio Group.
And they umbrella which brands?
I never remember them all when I reel them off, but it's Wharfedale, Quad, Leak, Audiolab, Castle, and Luxman, and Mission. Yeah, I told you I'd leave one out.
How do you fit in terms of how the sound design comes out for that? What's your role within that company?
Well, basically, my nomenclature is Director of Acoustic Design. Mm-hmm. That covers a whole panoply of stuff. My day-to-day job is designing loudspeakers. And I direct a group of engineers to basically put together loudspeaker designs which I hope are popular, and they certainly seem to be, but also the electronics designers. We have some very talented electronics designers, some of whom working in the UK, and they often call me in sort of golden ear projects, sit down and make sure that they're achieving what we all want to achieve, really, which is reproduction of enjoyable music in the home.
Today's episode is sponsored by Nordost. Ready to take your system to the next level? Transform the way you listen with Nordost's world-class hi-fi cables and audio enhancers. Nordost's superior design philosophy and exacting craftsmanship bring out every musical detail, connecting you with the tunes you love. Hear the difference as your equipment comes to life, turning every listening session into an unforgettable audio journey. Nordost, the clear choice for the best connection. That's www.nordost.com. Today's episode of the Occasional Podcast is sponsored by Wharfedale. Wharfedale has been hand-building their speakers in Brooklyn, New York for 25 years. Each pair of speakers is handcrafted to bring you closer to the music in your collection. Check out their entire line of speakers and where to hear them for yourself at Wharfedale.com. That's DEVOREFIDELITY.com.
So I'd like actually to touch base with you on a couple of brands, but maybe I'd like to start out with Wharfedale, because I currently have a pair of the Super Linton Wharfedales in, and they are a new take on the Linton. They have a really cool base that allows you to store LPs underneath them. Was that at all part of the design process to have that? Was the stand, when you first started doing the Linton, was it part of the idea, or was that something that came after?
I'd love to say it was part of the idea, but it just turned out that way. It's the stand was designed to give the right height for the speakers when you're sitting down on your couch and listening, and it just so happens that they accommodate a 12-inch LP, which is great, and a lot of people love that.
When it comes to that Linton footprint, with the stands, it essentially takes up the same amount of space as a floor stander. In your experience, do you think that you're better off going with a floor stander, or is there something special about the way you can design with that box with that empty space that's the stand underneath it? Or generally speaking, are you better off going with a floor stander that encompasses the full real estate?
Well, floor standers are actually more difficult to design for accommodation in various people's rooms, because once you have a floor stander which is solid going all the way down to the floor, then you're essentially coupling the bass units to the floor acoustically. We have various ways of getting around that in a Wharfedale floor standers, but if you want what I would call the cleanest, not necessarily low bass, but the cleanest upper bass, that seems to come from stand mount loudspeakers. And if you look back at the tradition of British monitor class loudspeakers, they're all stand mounting.
Yeah. There's a lot of brands out there that shoot for in marketing and branding and this, that I'm a good, everybody I think searches for good value for the price.
Yeah.
Okay. Good value for the price. But not all the brands really get that. Whether you believe it to be true with the Wharfedale brand or not, I do think that there is an attachment to the brand of that idea that you have successfully achieved. Good sound for the money. When you look at an assignment like the Wharfedale brand that already has like kind of a high thing when it comes to price per value, what are like the biggest hurdles in your mind of making a speaker like that? And where do you think the money's best left to other things? Where do you like to invest the money? Because I feel like sometimes cabinets are the first thing to go, but when I got the Super Linton in, the cabinet was like pretty nice, and the finishes were like, oh, there's a variety of finish, not a vinyl wrap or whatever, for instance. So how do you kind of take on that assignment and your approach?
Well, my love is, like I said, to make speakers that other people love. Essentially, I do design for my own love of music. I love to design speakers which I sit down and listen for hours on end to all different types and genres of music. That's what gives me a thrill, and I'm pleased to say that other people get off on that as well. That means that I want to get my speakers out there to as many people as possible. And therefore, if they're affordable, then instead of, with the high-end speakers, we could talk, say, of producing 100 pairs a year or something. I'm only getting that into 100 homes a year. Whereas with something like the Linton, where I was doing a demonstration over in Barcelona a few weeks ago, and I said to the guys there, how many Lintons do you sell? And he said, generally a pair a day. That's just one retailer in Spain. So they give you an idea of how many people out there globally are enjoying Lintons at the moment. That gives me a good feeling, because I know that I'm helping those people have such a great time listening to music. But to get to that point of making something affordable, the only way to do it is to produce it yourself. So we're lucky that out in China we have our own factory producing as much of the loudspeaker as we possibly can. And that's a really good way of keeping costs down, particularly, as you say, in the cabinets, where we have skilled craftsmen working on veneering loudspeakers to what I call a very high-class furniture standard. So you're not just buying something that sounds great, but also looks great in your living room, and that's very important these days.
This is a question I've asked many designers, and I apologize if you've heard it, but I'm very interested to get your response. Do British speakers have a unique sound in the marketplace? Do you design to a British sound or an ideal of a British sound? Because you were mentioning, starting from the LS35A and the two-way monitors, and the Linton's obviously a three-way monitor, but that size and shape, I would say, some would argue it's kind of UK-oriented. It's popular there, to say the least. Do you think that there is a British sound, and do you try to shoot for something similar in your designs?
Well, I think there is a classic British sound. I wouldn't say that all British loudspeakers necessarily follow that, but if we look back at the classic British sound, it really came out of the work that the BBC was doing in the 50s and then 60s, which led to what I would call a monitor class loudspeaker, where the main focus was on achieving a very natural vocal sound. And the basis of the design is really, and it's particularly exemplified by the LS35A, is that if you get the vocals and instruments like cello and violin right, then everything else will follow. The reason for that is because what you're essentially doing is you're marrying the fundamental tones of the music to the harmonics. And that means that your ear is not having to do so much work in trying to filter everything to make it sound natural. What is coming out of the loudspeaker sounds natural, and that means that as a human being you can relax and enjoy the music. Now, obviously the LS35A is limited at its frequency extremes. Everybody knows that, and people forgive it because of what it does in the mid-range. But you can go up in size to much bigger loudspeakers, like you're experiencing with the Super Linton, and get those frequency extremes while still enjoying that classic mid-band performance. And that, I would say, exemplifies what I would call the classic British sound.
You mentioned two ways. The Linton's a three-way. Is there anything inherently magical in the simplicity of a British two-way design? And how have you treated that differently, or how was your approach different doing a three-way with like the Linton and such, or any three-way really?
I started off my career designing two-way loudspeakers, and I still like doing two-way loudspeakers. I think there's an essential clarity and purity in the, if you like, the smaller cabinets, where you've only got one crossover to deal with, and that's a big advantage in terms of balancing the loudspeaker. But what we did when we got to the Linton, because it's a larger loudspeaker, we're basically able to tack a bass unit onto what is essentially a two-way.
Okay.
So, we're taking a 5 1/4 inch unit with a 1 inch treble unit, and then saying, okay, we can take that type of performance and get it from a three-way just by adding on an 8-inch bass unit. And once you start doing that, then you've really got something which is behaving, if you like, more like a two-way, but with added extension in the bass.
So do you think that inherently that the idea of the British two-way design, there is some special magic to it? I mean, you're looking to tap back into that. Like, there's something.
I don't like to use the word magic, but I think that people talk about loudspeaker design as a black art, and there's some magic in
Okay.
in some of the things that happen, and there's a lot of marketing BS which the marketing teams use based on that. I don't honestly think there's any magic that's going on in there, but what it does allow you to do is it allows you to concentrate on what really matters in a loudspeaker, which, as I say, is balancing the fundamental tones to the harmonics and making sure you get that balance right. And once you do that, then the rest of the loudspeaker sort of naturally follows. But sometimes when you're aiming for what I would call the ultimate performance from a two-way loudspeaker, then you can spend a lot of time tinkering with the smallest details in the loudspeaker in order to eke out that little bit extra performance. And that can be real fun, but it takes a long time.
You talked about marketing and the fundamentals that you value in the speaker design. When a person looks at a speaker and all they have to go off of is the specs and the marketing and such, what would you like to address as some of the biggest misconceptions that maybe marketing dilutes as to what really makes a speaker good, what really matters if you can't listen to it? There's a lot about measurements and range and everything is like 20 to 20.
Yeah, I've gone on record to say that the only measurements that matter are the ones that matter to the designer. You cannot assess a loudspeaker from measurements. It does not give you an idea of the musicality of the loudspeaker. It only tells you a broad brush approach as to whether the designer has got things relatively right. I can, when I'm designing loudspeakers, I will generally go through between 15 to, in one case, 174 crossover designs. Each of those designs will measure well. because they're based upon measurements that I've made of the drive units and in the cabinet and so on. So they'll all measure great, but they'll all sound completely different. And if we take the case of 174 crossovers, that was an extreme case where I had 2.5 years, thanks to COVID, to potter around and really work hard at refining that particular loudspeaker design. And people are surprised when I show them the measurements because they look essentially the same for all of the 174, but I can tell you every single crossover sounded different. So measurements, I don't think play any relevance in the assessment of a loudspeaker for the end user. What you can tell from the specifications is a rough idea of how low the speaker goes down in the bass, for example. The -6 dB point is generally gives you an idea of what you can expect from the loudspeaker to go down to in the room, whether you need a subwoofer or not, for example. The other aspect you should look at is sensitivity, because that will dictate what amplifier power you're using. So if you've got a speaker with a sensitivity of 82 or 83 decibels for 1 watt and you're using it in a large room, you're going to need a big amplifier in order to get the dynamics, and you're going to have to make sure that the speaker can handle those sort of dynamics. On the other hand, if you've got something like the Super Linton, which is 90 decibels for 1 watt, then you know that you can use a tube amp very successfully with those speakers. Apart from that, I don't think anything else really makes much sense in terms of what the music's going to sound like when you get the speakers home.
With the original Linton, correct me if I'm wrong, but was that a pretty successful model for you as a company in terms of sales?
It's been unbelievably successful.
So when you got, whoever started the idea, we have the Super Linton now. What exactly were the design? What did you want to improve on such a successful original piece?
Well, I think I should start by talking about how the Linton came about, because it was a very interesting project for me personally. It grew out of the Denton that we designed for Wharfedale's 80th anniversary, which was me looking back at the type of speakers that I was selling when I was in retail in the late 60s, early 70s. And I loved the Wharfedale Denton and the Wharfedale Linton, largely because of the way they looked as much as the way they sounded. The cabinet design, which was done by Mr. Gutman of the Design Council in the UK, is an absolute classic. It's still a classic today. It yields what I would call a furniture class loudspeaker cabinet. But the sound from Wharfedale back then was so rich and warm and really drew you into the music. And that's what I loved about it. So we designed the Denton for the 80th anniversary. And that seemed to strike a chord with people. We had a modicum of success with that, which showed that people did want that style of loudspeaker. And then, as a result of that, they said, as we sat down as a team to discuss what projects we should do, and the team said, well, okay, the Denton's been pretty successful. What should we do next? I said, well, obviously the Linton, because it was a very, very popular loudspeaker for Wharfedale back in the 70s. So I designed the Linton prototype, and when everybody looked at it, they went, can't sell that, it's too big. Because at that time, everybody was doing smaller and smaller loudspeakers. And I said, well, okay, there you are. You wanted it, you've got it. And, of course, we put it out there, and like I say, it struck a chord. People loved it, and they still love it to this day. Now, apart from that, I noticed that after it had been in production for 4 or 5 years, that there were a few people on social media who were saying, yeah, we love the Linton sound. We love it, does everything you say in terms of its warmth and its richness and its attractiveness, but we want more detail. And you have to interpret when people say detail what they're really talking about, because I'm not sure that people know what they're talking about. I mean, there's a lot of loudspeakers that I listen to, and this is my personal opinion, that when people say they're very detailed, it means they've got a lot of treble. And that can be a bit wearing. And it also means that you're restricted very often to the type of music that you can play, which is not my idea of what a loudspeaker should be at all. But I think what people were really looking for was, let's say, more articulation in the speaker, so that it would bring out more of the detail. It would bring out more focus of the performers in the room, so that the stereo image would be sharper, more detailed in those terms, in musical terms. And people were doing all sorts of things like, ripping the crossovers apart and putting in different components. And I just thought, I'm actually the best person to do that. So I sat down and I went through, and first of all, one of the things I noticed on social media was that people were putting their Lintons close to the wall, which is not how I designed them. I designed them for spacing, 2 or 3 feet away from a wall. So I thought, okay, if that's what people are doing, then let's design a bass system which allows that to be done. So our engineering team, we talked about it, and we produced a bass unit which had the dynamic performance and the tightness of bass and the resolution of bass, which allows you to do that. That then demanded actually slightly more volume in the cabinet. So we talked to the ID designer, and he said, well, let's raise the height of the cabinet because the design will allow that. It'll still look good, so we raised the height and got ourselves more internal volume. And then I started work on having got that basis, then started working on the crossover. Got more improvement out of the mid-range unit. We designed a much better cabinet, which is a twin-ply cabinet that uses, not plywood, but it uses 2 sections of wood with a damping layer in between. And did various other things. It improved the mid-range enclosure, acoustic absorbent and things like that. We then needed a better performance from the treble unit to keep up with what we'd done for the bass and the mid-range. And that led us to looking at taking what we'd researched for the Dovedale treble unit and then producing a new treble unit for the Super Linton. And then it was down to the crossover. And that was a whole heap of fun because we were able to keep the same elements that everybody loved about Linton, but just, like I say, introduce that extra focus on having instruments and people portrayed around and behind the loudspeakers when you're listening in the room. And people have loved that. And I've been demonstrating here, and people have been just saying how incredible it is to have that feeling that the whole music is laid out in front of them and the speakers almost disappear.
Our friends at ZMF Headphones are sponsors of today's episode. ZMF is a curated collection of various sounds and styles in the form of dynamic and planar magnetic wood headphones, designed by founder Zach Merbach since 2011. ZMF has garnered an A+ recommended component in Stereophile, Headphone of the Year on Headphonics.com, and been a 2-time winner of the SBAF Golden Schlong Award. ZMF Headphones. That's the letter ZMF. HEADPHONES.com. ZMF Headphones is the place to go to check out ZMF's collection and learn more. ZMF, traditional craft and modern acoustics. Tired of audio reviews that sound like they were written by robots? Us too. For the last 15 years, Part-Time Audiophile has been an open revolt against boring. And this year, we're doubling down. We have a brand new look and a brand new name, but the same old attitude. Find us at pt.audio for all your turntable throwdowns and amplifier face-offs. Great sound meets good times at pt.audio.
It's very, very interesting to me. I've almost forgot that I've been doing this podcast for many, many years, but for the first 3 or 4 years while I was reviewing gear and doing the podcast, I was tackling this exact thing that you just said. I was just curious to myself, how many people out there mistake detail for more trouble? Getting the products in and reviewing them, there might be some truth to that for some individuals. I'm not saying everyone, of course, but when you talk about the feedback you get, more detail, I'm like, is it? Or is it just more trouble? I was really, grappling with that myself even for the first 4 years, and I had kind of forgot about it. And then when you said it, I was like, oh man, I was thinking the same thing for so many years. And what is the detail like in the mids? What does it really sound like around the voice, and not just that high information that you feel from the treble? So that's a great point. You mentioned design tendencies, industrial design for speakers. For a while, I'm not sure if it's still the trend. I'd have to dig into it. But it was to be narrower and narrower, smaller visual from the front. And I've asked designers why this occurred, and they said, well, a lot of it is visual mirage, is that it's getting smaller. It takes up less space because it's a narrow cabinet. And to keep the full range, they put the base cabs on the side. The Linton, the Super Linton, it's all there. It's wider. Is there anything special acoustically that happens when a speaker is allowed to be wider, or can all the exact same sound be generated from something that's very narrow with bass on the side?
Yeah, the problem is a simple thing which is loudspeaker designers call the baffle step. The baffle step is, if you imagine at high frequencies, the sound from the drive units is coming directly at you. And because the baffle, the front face of the speaker, is stopping that sound bleeding around the sides of the loudspeaker, all the energy is coming towards you. Now, as the wavelength gets longer and longer, as the frequency goes down, as you get more into the bass region, then when the half wavelength becomes the same width as the front of the loudspeaker, the sound starts to bleed around the outside. Now, it's not a brick wall thing. It happens over a range of 200 to 300 hertz. But it does begin to fall off because instead of all that energy coming towards you, it's now feeding the rest of the room. And that means that essentially you lose up to 6 decibels of output. Now, if you don't correct for that, then the speaker sounds as though it's got no bass because you've got all this energy coming from the mid and high frequencies, and your bass is 6 decibels lower. So what we have to do is we have to compensate for that in the crossover and really damp down the mid-range and the treble in order to match the level of the bass. Now, I maintain, and it's my view, that the ear can discriminate between this, and you can hear this junction between the sound coming directly at you and what is bleeding round into the rest of the room. It's almost like another crossover. And you're aware of it because generally with narrow baffled speakers, it occurs in the range 600 to 800 hertz. So it's all in the mid-range, and that is where you really hear it. Now, for something like the Linton, we're talking about 350 hertz for the range at which the baffle step is mainly happening. And we're lucky that in our rooms, we have something called room gain. Now, room gain starts to work from below 400 hertz and really takes hold at about the 300 hertz region. So we've got a bit of fall off from the baffle step in Linton at 350 hertz, centered around there. But at the same time, we've got room gain coming in, which is boosting it up again. And that makes it sound more natural. Okay. So you're not aware, first of all, it's lower in the mid-range, and B, because it's working, your loudspeakers are now working with the room, especially when you put them closer to the rear wall, which Super Linton allows you to do, you're much less aware of the baffle step. And I think that gives you a much more comfortable feeling and adds to that warmth and richness of sound, which sounds so natural, especially on voices, especially on instruments like cello and double bass.
I do find that very interesting, and I'll just give you a small anecdote from my experience, because I had a pair of two-ways, fairly large two-ways in the house, and I'm adjusting them for the wall, as you say. And this is just what I noticed. as I move them, I can hear the bass changing quite a bit. Closer, more, farther away, less. So what do? I adjust. I just like, here we go. Okay, the bass is where I want it. Stop there. Then the very next pair is the super Littons that come in. And I guess, to what your credit, I don't want you to think I'm like over complimenting you here, but I put the Littons there, and that change was not there at the same distance. So same speaker, same distance from the wall I didn't push them all the way close to the wall, but my experience when there, it was the same here, same further away. There was no micro adjustments. I'm talking the volume of the bass was changing greatly with a small distance, which was not the case with the super Littons. And this is part of the design goal that you were saying. It's to no, but are you saying that speaker can actually go inches from the wall?
If your room allows it.
Yeah, how far away should they be is part of the question.
I find that most people just put speakers in a room and expect them to work. Mm-hmm. And I try to design loudspeakers which allow people just to do that, so they don't have to, they don't have to worry, basically, that whether they've got the right thing. But if you want to really tune your loudspeakers for a room, you shouldn't have to do micro adjustments. It shouldn't make that much difference. I mean, I took a pair of my designs to a well-known reviewer, and we brought the loudspeakers into his listening room, and he said, okay, you adjust the loudspeakers, I'll go and make some coffee, right? And he made some coffee, and he came back, and he said, okay, you carry on, I'll do some writing or something. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you carry on adjusting. And I said, I've finished. He said, already? I said, yeah, well, have a listen, see what you think. So we listened. I said, what do you think? He said, they sound great. I said, yeah, that's fine. He said, how did you do that? I said, do what? He said, well, most people come in here and they spend up to a day adjusting their loudspeakers to sound good. And you've just come in and you've plonked them down and they're ready to go. That's the basis of it. You should be able to do that. But if you really want to tune your loudspeakers for the room, it's very easy. Just play some music, move the loudspeakers closer to the front wall, further away from the front wall, until everything sounds natural. That's it. Until you should just be enjoying the music. It shouldn't be something which you have to worry yourself about as to whether you've got, whether an inch closer here or a half an inch further away should make all the difference. It should be very easy to do.
Yeah, I think for me, doing a review, I just want to give the speakers the best shot they can. So, but honestly, a lot of it comes from my readers' feedback, where like they'll be away from the wall, and I'll listen to them, and then I'll put them closer to the wall and shoot the stills, and people will be online like, I can't trust this review. Look how close they are to the wall. And I was like, I just put them back for the photos, and it's very like somebody will completely invalidate every part of my review if they see a still image of the speaker closer than what they think is the appropriate distance.
Well, one of the big myths in hi-fi is that if you have rear-ported speakers, you can't put them close to a front wall. That's absolute rubbish. I mean, all that happens when you put a rear-ported speaker closer to the front wall is that the bass increases. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. There's absolutely nothing wrong in doing it at all. There's nothing that gets in the way. I mean, there are now, I started designing what we call the slot-mounted bass system for Wharfedale many years ago, where we have a port firing down to a slot in the plinth, which is close to the floor. That gives us a similar performance advantage from floor-standing speakers that allows you to position the speakers easily in the room. There's now quite a lot of speakers where the port is firing directly at the floor. Are you telling me that's wrong because you can't have a port that's close to another surface? Of course you can. It shows that it works. Same with a rear-ported loudspeaker. If you put it close to the front wall, it just improves the bass response. Sometimes it can be too much, in which case move them further away. Very simple.
Two of the different aspects of speaker review that I think may be intertwined greatly, or you could think of them separately, is tonality, which I think you've spoken to being tonally dense, rich, warm, a pleasing overall tone to the speaker. Another thing I've spoken about that has been a little more controversial after it is the idea of dimensionality or sound staging. When you're designing a speaker, when you're evaluating your own work, what value do you place on and how much do you think about the idea of imaging, staging, and or depth and width of a speaker?
Well, again, I think you have to be careful with what you're talking about, because people might be horrified to know that a lot of vocals are recorded with a mono microphone and then moved into place and given some depth by added reverb, whether it's electronic reverb or, very often done in the computer. It amuses me sometimes when people talk about bands which are basically electronic based, that they talk about the space around the instruments and the space around the vocals, when I know perfectly well that there was no space recorded because they weren't recorded in stereo. Yeah, and all the atmosphere was added later.
Yeah, and then added to the atmosphere that you're hearing from your room.
Yeah.
So we have one atmosphere plus another atmosphere, right?
Sure, sure. So I think you have to be careful there. What I'm looking for is, if we take a naturally recorded track, and there's quite a lot out there, then you should have the feeling that the performers are in the room with you. That's the ideal. For me, that is what hi-fi is all about. Now, whether those performers are behind the speakers, around the speakers, in between the speakers, or in some cases even forward of the speakers, depends on the recording. And the loudspeakers should reflect that. So this idea of extreme 3D depth going way back behind the speakers, it does occur with some recordings, but not many. Most of the focus from recordings is either instrumentals and vocals between the speakers or just behind. There are not many recordings out there which have this extreme depth. But you can engineer in your loudspeaker design, you can engineer something which makes it sound as though there's extreme depth. And I don't like that because I don't think it's accurate.
I just want to shift gears a little bit from Wharfedale to Quad. You guys recently have some new amplifiers that came out. They have a very interesting industrial design that is like an homage, I think, and a nice extension of the original design. You've mentioned this a couple times. But how much do you think that external design impacts the way someone thinks either a square box amp sounds or a speaker sounds, in your opinion, from your kind of like...
Well, I think there's a lot of interest in what I would call some of the classic designs of the 50s, 60s, 70s, even 80s. The reason for that is because we're all looking back at history with rose-tinted spectacles. You know? We don't remember the ugly stuff, but we remember the beautiful stuff. Yeah. And I don't think we should make any apology, and it's happening not just in hi-fi, but in cars and lots of other things where people are looking back to that age and saying, gosh, there was some really good individual designers out there who were producing something which was really attractive. Mm-hmm. And what we've done, for example, with the Quad 33303 is look at one of those designs. And the original 33303 was groundbreaking in its day with the way it looked. And we thought people might still respond to that if it was updated and produced today. Well, interestingly enough, for that design, we also, for the power amplifier, looked at what Quad were doing with their transistor technology, because transistors back then were actually pretty poor and very difficult to get a good performance from. And Quad came up with what they called the output triple, which was an array of driver and output transistors, which were close coupled in such a way that they had a natural feedback, natural localized feedback between them, which gave a performance advantage. And we looked at that again and looked at all the research behind it, and then updated it for modern transistors. And we found that, yeah, you can actually get a performance advantage from it. So we kept that in the 303 power amplifier. And we've had reviewers saying that it sounds sweet and natural and controlled, everything that you want from a hi-fi amplifier.
When I was doing research for our series on vintage gear, I did poll a lot of individuals to say, what are the most iconic speakers in all of hi-fi? And of course, we already spoke about the LS35A was probably one of the number ones, but either a close tie, a winner, or maybe second to that was the Quad ELS 57. Yeah. There's a couple other numbers in there. In your mind, working on the brand, what do you think was so iconic about that particular speaker for that time and place, and why has it seen such longevity in the marketplace?
Well, the ESL57 was the world's first push-pull loudspeaker. There had been other electrostatic speakers before that, but they was what we call single-ended, and therefore they actually were fairly high distortion if you wanted them to produce bass. Mm-hmm. So mainly they were only used for treble units. But the ESL57 was a full-range electrostatic loudspeaker, and it shocked people at the time because once you get rid of the cabinet, once you get rid of big diaphragms having to move in order to produce the sound, you've got instead got an incredibly lightweight diaphragm moving at very low distortion. You suddenly get this clarity, which I think is tough to beat. I mean, I'm not saying that you can't get that from moving core loudspeakers. You can get close to it, but every time we demonstrate quad electrostatic loudspeakers, there are gasps from people because of the way that they sound. They don't suit everybody because they're quite big. The original ESL57 was designed in the days of mono, so one of those in a room was fairly easy to accommodate. Sales dropped when it went to stereo. When stereo really took off and you had to have two of them in a room, then sales started dropping. And that's obviously still a problem in this day and age, that big electrostatic loudspeakers are tough for a lot of people to accommodate, and that's fair enough. But I owned a pair of ESL 57s back in the day, driving them with quad tube amplifiers, and I loved them. And I still love the way the ESLs sound today. We're just about to introduce a new ESL, which we call the ESL-X, which has got all the updates that we can put into our latest range of electrostatic speakers. And we're loving demonstrating those to people.
I think that one of the interesting things about audio is that it utilizes old, you could argue, very fundamental technologies. We still use, with all the material science in the world, many speakers are still made from paper cone drivers, some of the original material. We talk about the ESL design. What is it that we can still eke out of material design here, and what have you guys done different? Like, what is the improvement on the ESL that you guys have made in the newer versions? So how do we further refine the electrostatic design, and is there any other designs you think that might be the future for beyond the paper cone?
A lot of the reasons that we're still using, I suppose, what you might call old technologies is because of the refinement that's gone on over the years can still go on. We can still find better materials to use. We are still finding better ways to make crossovers, transformers, everything else that goes on inside a loudspeaker. We're still finding better ways to make cabinets even. Mm-hmm. The advance in not just the materials that we use, but the technology we use to design has got better. So, as I said earlier, the measurements mainly matter to the designer. the ways that we measure things are still not good as far as the dynamics of a musical performance are concerned. That's what we hear. That's what we've got to try and judge things by, which is why I spent so long listening as well as a long time measuring. But the measurements are now getting so good that we can start to delve down into what is really going on in a loudspeaker, any type of loudspeaker. And that enables us as designers to do a better job. It's much like the internal combustion engine. You know, it's been around forever. We're now gradually moving towards electric cars, but electric cars are still in their infancy.
Right.
Battery technology is improving all the time. Electric motors are improving all the time. The computers that control them are improving all the time. But we've got this great depth of knowledge about the internal combustion engine that if I compared what cars are like now back to when I first started driving, you know, to get back into a car that I first started driving in makes me think how noisy, how polluting this thing is, and how difficult to drive compared with today's cars using internal combustion engines. Are incredibly quiet, incredibly smooth, and really easy to drive. So you can still get improvements out of older technologies, if you like. But what we've done in the latest ESL is to look at every component, like we always do, like we're doing in all our loudspeakers. So everything down to the grill cloth. The biggest improvement we've got is actually improvement in the manufacturing of the transformer, because the transformer is obviously taking the output from your amplifier and transforming it into something that we can drive a diaphragm with. So the transformer, as in tube amps, the transformer is the key to the design.
Do you think that we have eked out all of the possible technology we can of the paper cone, or do you think that through some science we might have a better version of the paper cone driver than you could get with other? And also, party to that, I just like to ask, and I know I ask this to a lot of designers, but do you think there's anything particular magical about the soft dome tweeter that has like won over the hearts of so many audiophiles when it comes to like any other material? Because I feel like that again is like an old school kind of tech that has lasted, and many people think, you know, obviously you can design around it, but it seems to be very popular among a lot of designers and the enthusiasm for it among consumers.
Well, you got two questions there. The paper cones for a start.
Yeah.
You know, in the old days when I was first designing loudspeakers, paper cone design was almost like a black art. You had a few people who had spent decades listening to different shapes, thicknesses, sizes, methods of termination, and everything else, and they just had this catalogue of what works inside their brains.
Wow.
And if you wanted a really good paper cone driver, you go to these people and say, design me something. And because they knew everything that worked, they were able to do that. Not easily. It took a lot of work to get it right, but when it was right, it was superb. Now we can do a lot of that work in the computer.
Okay.
So that helps a lot, and means that we can generate paper cones, which we're not just incorporating, for example, in our latest quad loudspeakers, we have a combination of acrylic components that we put in with the paper pulp in order to really clean up the mid-range and give us the performance that we need. So we can do all that sort of thing and therefore get the same, what people love about paper.
What do you think what is that?
Well, it comes back to this natural sound.
Okay.
Because you've got what I would call an incoherent material composition in the cone. In other words, you've got wood fibers which are being pulped and which are not lying in a straight line. Right. They're all mixed up in all sorts of different directions. So when the cone speaks to you, you know, you're not hearing something as in, for example, a Kevlar cone where you have fibers which are running in two directions because they're woven together. You're not hearing, I think one reviewer has said he can always identify a Kevlar cone from the way it sounds, although that reviewer did admit that he couldn't do it in the Linton. But that's because we take a lot of care in trying to get that Kevlar sound out. But it's still there, and it's something that we have to overcome. Okay. Whereas with a paper cone, it just comes naturally. And I think it's probably because it's what I would call an incoherent arrangement of fibers within the cone. And that's what's good about it. You also remarked soft dome treble units. Now, soft domes were something that I grew up with, and then I was around when the market gradually went over to metal domes, to hard domes. And of course, there's quite a lot of technology out there now still in producing, diamond sputtered domes and titanium and beryllium and so on. And all those materials, yes, they're all fun to play with. They can all yield results in a certain direction. But I think the reason that a lot of people come back to enjoying the sound of soft domes is because they are, or they can be, naturally damped. And the problem with going to a rigid dome is you lose that damping effect. And when I did a lot of research into this in the 2000s, because I was interested in why a hard dome, a metal domes which were around then, which were resonating well above the audio frequencies, so in the sort of 26, 28 kilohertz area. Why did they sound metallic? That's what we wanted to know. And what my research told me was that if you have something which resonates at 26 kilohertz, you can see a ripple of that at half the frequency, which is 13, and that's what you identify with. I was also working at that time with NXT, which some people might remember as the, turning a flat piece of highly rigid material into a loudspeaker. And what the NXT research showed us was that when you've got something which is resonating, you really want, if it's going to perform best, you really want it to resonate over a wide range of frequencies. If it just resonates at one frequency, even though that frequency may be ultrasonic, you can still identify the material. So if that's the case, then the reason people love soft domes is because it's more difficult to identify the material. And it comes back, like I was saying, that if you give the ear something natural and easy to work with, it spends less time having to try and overcome the problems that it's hearing. And therefore you can relax and enjoy the music. If you're giving the ear something which it feels it has to compensate for, and we have in our heads the world's best graphic equalizer. It's a natural, our ear-brain combination has a natural filtering process which allows us to accommodate all sorts of things which don't sound quite right and make them sound right. But to do that, it has to work hard. It's like a supercomputer, working flat out and getting very hot doing it. If you can take that processing out, then you begin to relax and enjoy the music. When I was in retail, I used to say to people, when you put together a good hi-fi system on which you can enjoy the music, you will spend less time watching television. It was a great selling point. And I think that's very true today. When you look at your TV and you've got 152 channels of rubbish, and it's much easier to go and stream some music from a high quality provider and just find out what it recommends and get lost in music that you love. That for me is what a hi-fi system should be. This focus that I think the modern audiophile, if I can use that word in a discriminatory way, the modern audiophile is often looking for something which is perhaps larger than life, that's crystal clear and And like I say, what people talk to me about a very detailed sound. And I don't think that's what hi-fi should be about. I think that leads to you being able to play only a very small niche example of good recordings. And it doesn't lead to overall satisfaction. I think people get very tired of systems that sound like that then they end up in what I would call upgrade-itis. They're looking for something that makes a difference, that can get them away from something that they perceive as uncomfortable. I'd much prefer to have hi-fi systems where you sit down and you immediately feel comfortable. And therefore you can just go on playing music.
Peter, thanks so much for coming on the show, man. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
The Occasional Podcast is a production of the Part-Time Audiophile Network, which includes parttimeaudiophile.com, The Occasional Magazine, the PTA Newsletter, and audiohead.com. You can stay in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. The Occasional Podcast is produced and hosted by Brian Hunter, executive produced by Scott Hall at PTA Productions. The Occasional Podcast and its original associated music is monitored, mixed, and mastered on the Focal Trio 6 BE studio monitors. AI songs produced by Udio.com. If you haven't already, please subscribe to The Occasional Podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.